The origins of the Latvian Legion's fateful stand trace back not to the front lines of 1945, but to the shifting political geography of the interwar and early wartime period in the Baltics. After the conclusion of the First World War, Latvia emerged as an independent state in 1918, following centuries under various imperial dominations: Swedish, Russian, and German. By the 1930s, Latvia was a sovereign republic, maintaining a policy of neutrality amid rising tensions in Europe. However, the Soviet-German Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 and its secret protocols designated Latvia as within the Soviet sphere of influence. Soviet occupation followed swiftly in June 1940. Over the next year, Latvia experienced mass arrests, deportations, and suppression of political and civil life. An estimated 15,000 Latvians were deported during this period, with significant representation among former officials, intellectuals, and army officers. This occupation fostered a widespread sense of hostility toward the Soviet regime. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, Germany's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, brought Wehrmacht troops into Latvia. German forces rapidly displaced Soviet control, and many Latvians initially viewed the German arrival as a form of liberation. Some hoped for the restoration of Latvian independence, but the Nazi administration quickly integrated Latvia into the Reichskommissariat Ostland and imposed German civil governance. Local hopes of autonomy were extinguished, but for many Latvians, the German occupation still appeared as the lesser of two evils, especially in comparison to the preceding Soviet repression. Amid the German-Soviet conflict, the question of military collaboration arose. By 1943, after significant losses on the Eastern Front, the German High Command initiated the formal creation of Waffen-SS units composed of non-German nationals. The Latvian Legion, officially formed in 1943, was comprised mainly of conscripts and volunteers, and eventually numbered around 87,000 men across several formations. The two primary divisions were the 15th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Latvian, and the 19th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 2nd Latvian. These units were subordinated to German command, but staffed predominantly by Latvian personnel and officers. The motivations for joining the Legion varied. Some Latvians enlisted voluntarily, driven by anti-Soviet sentiment, nationalism, or a sense of duty to defend their homeland from renewed Soviet occupation. Others were conscripted under German occupation policies. Notably, recruitment efforts emphasized defense of Latvian soil, which played a persuasive role in securing enlistments despite the overarching Nazi framework. Still, this collaboration was contested within Latvian society and continues to generate debate in post-war historiography. As the tide of war turned against Germany in 1944, the Red Army launched major offensives that began to reclaim lost territory. The Baltic Offensive of autumn 1944 was particularly consequential. Soviet forces penetrated deep into the Baltics, seeking to cut off and encircle German Army Group North. By October 1944, much of Latvia had fallen back under Soviet control, except for a salient in the Courland Peninsula. It was here that the remnants of Army Group North, renamed Army Group Courland, found themselves isolated, including the bulk of the Latvian Legion. The Courland Pocket, or Kurland Kessel, would become the final theater of combat for the Latvian Legion. The Red Army encircled approximately 2,000 Axis troops in the region, including 6 divisions of the Latvian Legion. Despite being trapped, the Germans fortified the area and conducted repeated defensive operations. From October 1944 to May 1945, 6 major Soviet offensives attempted to eliminate the pocket, but they failed to break through. Throughout this period, the Latvian Legion held its positions under increasingly desperate circumstances. This encirclement marked the beginning of the end, but it was not yet final. The broader geopolitical context made extraction impossible. Germany was collapsing on all fronts, and the Courland Pocket, although symbolically significant, had little strategic value for the German High Command by 1945. Yet its defenders were ordered to hold the line. Within this context, the Latvian Legion's last stand took shape, not as a single battle or final clash, but as a prolonged and attritional defense conducted in isolation. Supplies dwindled, morale eroded, and the soldiers faced the certainty of eventual surrender. For many Latvian troops, this entrapment raised existential questions about their future under Soviet reoccupation, especially given memories of 1940 and 41. Some hoped for Western intervention or an armistice that never came. In the final months of the war, the Courland pocket remained a contested and fortified zone, but increasingly disconnected from the central dynamics of the Eastern Front. While Berlin burned and the Third Reich crumbled, the Latvian Legion, along with German and other Axis troops, held out, not in expectation of victory, but in defiance of capitulation. Their fate would be sealed not on the battlefield, but in the armistice terms that followed in May 1945. As the Soviet Red Army resumed its push westward in early October 1944, the operational objective was clear: to destroy German Army Group North and eliminate all Axis resistance in the Baltics. The strategic encirclement of Courland was not incidental, but a calculated maneuver within the broader framework of the Baltic Offensive. Soviet forces under Marshal Bagramyan's First Baltic Front executed rapid penetrations, severing land connections between Army Group North and the rest of the German military structure. The Courland region, cut off by land but still tenuously linked to Germany by sea, now hosted over 2,000 German and Allied troops, including the majority of the Latvian Legion. The composition of the Courland forces reflected the patchwork nature of late-war German defenses. 6 Soviet attempts, termed the 1st through 6th Courland battles, were launched between October 1944 and April 1945. The 19th and 15th Latvian SS divisions were often positioned along critical sectors of the front, including the approaches to Liepāja and along the Venta River. Their tasks involved repelling Soviet armored and infantry assaults, often under artillery bombardment and in poor weather conditions that worsened logistics and troop fatigue. The opening engagements of the Courland standoff tested the Latvian Legion's cohesion. Despite dwindling German resources and flagging morale among other Axis units, many Latvian troops remained steadfast. Orders from higher command insisted on holding ground, partly due to Hitler's insistence that Courland would be vital for any future naval operations in the Baltic. In reality, the region's military significance had diminished, but its symbolic and propaganda value persisted. German broadcasts framed the defenders of Courland as embodying the spirit of resistance against Bolshevism, though the situation on the ground was one of attrition and strategic irrelevance. Conditions for the troops were harsh. The onset of winter in late 1944 brought freezing temperatures and mud-choked roads, severely hindering supply movements. Rations became inconsistent, medical supplies were short, and replacement troops were practically non-existent. Latvian field hospitals struggled to maintain operations under aerial bombardment, while combat engineers constantly rebuilt damaged trenches and defensive positions. Yet, morale among Latvian soldiers was bolstered by the belief that surrender to the Soviets might lead to execution or deportation, based on prior experience during the 1940-41 occupation. Thus, resistance was not solely obedience, it was self-preservation. On the Soviet side, troop numbers surged with reinforcements arriving from recently concluded operations in the central and southern sectors. Soviet divisions in the region included seasoned formations from the 51st and 2nd Baltic fronts, supported by artillery brigades and mechanized units. Soviet tactics in the Courland offensives relied heavily on massed artillery barrages followed by probing infantry assaults. However, the terrain, forests, marshes, and scattered rural settlements favored defense. German and Latvian units exploited these conditions to delay Soviet progress despite being numerically outmatched. Notably, civilian populations remained trapped in Courland as fighting escalated. Thousands of Latvians had been unable or unwilling to evacuate, and their presence complicated military operations. German authorities requisitioned resources from local populations, while Soviet artillery indiscriminately targeted towns suspected of hosting Axis positions. In Liepāja and surrounding villages, civilian shelters were constructed in basements, churches, and natural caves. Reports indicate food shortages, widespread illness, and the destruction of infrastructure critical to survival. Still, many civilians supported or aided Latvian troops, viewing them as protectors against Soviet return. The command structure within the Legion maintained operational discipline during this period. Officers such as Oberfuhrer Bruno Streckenbach for the 19th Division coordinated with German High Command to fortify key zones. Latvian officers, many of whom had served in the pre-war Latvian army, were instrumental in maintaining cohesion among the ranks, emphasizing national duty and the defense of homeland rather than ideological alignment with the Reich. In contrast, German command continued to prioritize broader strategic narratives, often ignoring on-the-ground logistical and humanitarian crises. As 1944 turned to 1945, it became evident that no relief would come. German naval convoys still ferried supplies across the Baltic, but with increasing Soviet submarine and air activity, such missions grew perilous. The Luftwaffe presence in Courland dwindled to a handful of aircraft, mostly used for reconnaissance. German command, under General Oberst Ferdinand Schörner and later Karl Hilpert, issued directives to maintain defensive posture, but gave no timeline or hope of breakout. For the Latvian Legion, this signaled that they were to remain in place, effectively stranded and facing inevitable encirclement by Soviet forces gathering strength for further offensives. Despite these constraints, the Legion executed multiple local counterattacks throughout the winter. These operations, often conducted in snow-covered forests or over frozen rivers, yielded limited territorial gains, but were primarily intended to relieve pressure on key positions. Sniper activity, mine warfare, and ambushes became common as the front stabilized. The Soviets, in turn, shifted to siege-like tactics, reconnaissance in force, heavy bombardment, and psychological operations, including leaflet drops urging surrender. By March 1945, strategic calculations had shifted decisively elsewhere, but in Courland, the war dragged on. For the Latvian Legion, every passing day was a mixture of tactical resistance and growing anticipation of a final reckoning. The sense of abandonment deepened. Still, the orders remained: hold position, maintain discipline, await further instructions that would never come. The Eastern Front had moved hundreds of kilometers westward, yet in this isolated corner of Latvia, the war's unresolved tension continued to accumulate, hour by hour, in bunkers and forests laced with barbed wire and memories. The strategic logic behind the Courland pocket's continued defense into the spring of 1945 was increasingly tenuous. For the German High Command, the enclave had ceased to hold genuine operational significance. Yet, Adolf Hitler personally ordered the retention of Courland as a fortress area, refusing to authorize evacuation or redeployment of Army Group Courland's 2,000 troops. This decision, grounded in ideological stubbornness and an aversion to retreat, left tens of thousands of soldiers, including the Latvian Legion, trapped in a pocket with no realistic path to victory or escape. Within this context, planning on both sides took on a cyclical nature. Soviet High Command, led by Marshals Leonid Govorov and Ivan Bagramyan, viewed the Courland pocket as a secondary priority by early 1945. The main Soviet thrusts had moved west toward Pomerania and Berlin. However, Stalin insisted on eliminating the pocket eventually, tasking the First and Second Baltic fronts with launching repeated offensives. These included large-scale artillery barrages, multi-division infantry advances, and encirclement attempts aimed at slicing the pocket into smaller, manageable segments. German command, led at this point by General Karl Hilpert, recognized the futility of the broader situation, but remained under strict orders to hold. In the Latvian Legion, divisional commanders emphasized defensive tactics, discipline, and battlefield endurance. The 19th Waffen-Grenadier Division was deployed in the northern sector near Saldus, while the 15th Division held positions closer to the Baltic coast and around the city of Liepaja. Each unit faced logistical problems, ammunition shortages, limited artillery support, and increasing gaps in supply chains. The Latvian Legion structure mirrored that of regular German Waffen-SS units, but maintained a significant Latvian officer corps and used the Latvian language for internal communications. Morale among the Legion's ranks varied. some units continued to believe in the possibility of Western Allied intervention or a negotiated surrender distinct from unconditional Soviet captivity. Others fought to prevent reoccupation of Latvia by the Red Army, fearing the reprisals and political purges that would likely follow. Propaganda efforts from both sides targeted these anxieties. Soviet broadcasts and airdropped leaflets promised amnesty for surrendering troops, contrasting it with grim reminders of Nazi war crimes and alleged collaboration. German and Latvian officers countered with warnings of deportations, executions, and loss of national identity under Soviet rule. In this battle of narratives, neither side succeeded in shifting the allegiance of the entrenched Latvian forces, though desertion and surrender became more common as food supplies dwindled and medical support collapsed. Latvian units adapted to the increasingly defensive posture through tactical adjustments. Engineers constructed extensive trench networks reinforced with timber and earthworks. Camouflaged observation posts and sniper nests dotted the forested areas, especially around the Tukums-Liepāja axis. Anti-tank ditches, barbed wire obstacles, and mined corridors turned natural terrain into layered defensive belts. Mobile patrols scouted Soviet positions and conducted limited harassment actions. Still, the pattern of warfare in Courland shifted towards static, positional engagements, reminiscent of earlier conflicts rather than the mobile warfare typical of World War II's later years. On the Soviet side, the 6th Courland Offensive in late March 1945 involved over 25 infantry divisions and more than 1,000 artillery pieces. The objective was to breach the German line near Jukhste and cut off access to the port at Liepāja. However, the offensive stalled after several days of heavy fighting. Soviet casualties mounted quickly due to well-prepared defensive fire and difficult terrain. The Latvian 19th Division played a critical role in repelling this assault, with some regiments holding their positions despite being outnumbered 3-1. Amid the stalemate, German naval operations provided a limited lifeline. The Kriegsmarine maintained transport routes across the Baltic Sea, linking Courland to East Prussia and the ports of Gotenhofen and Danzig. Supplies were sporadic and insufficient, but they allowed the evacuation of some wounded and facilitated communication with Berlin. For Latvian soldiers, these links reinforced hopes, however unrealistic, of survival outside Soviet hands. Meanwhile, the civilian situation inside Courland deteriorated sharply. Towns such as Aisput, Kuldīga, and Ventspils struggled with fuel shortages, failing medical infrastructure, and food rationing. Civilian authorities operated under German military oversight, but local self-organization emerged, often led by church officials, former municipal leaders, or cooperatives. For many Latvian civilians, the Legion represented a buffer, an imperfect but tangible form of defense. However, as weeks passed without relief, fear gave way to resignation. Despite the overall defensive stance, isolated offensive actions were launched by the Legion throughout this period. Small-scale counterattacks aimed to disrupt Soviet preparations or retake lost trenches. These operations, conducted with limited armor support, mostly captured or outdated German Panzer IVs and assault guns, had modest tactical success, but no impact on the broader strategic situation. They served primarily to maintain momentum and deny the initiative to Soviet forces. By April 1945, discipline within the Legion remained comparatively intact. This was due in part to a shared sense of national identity among the Latvian troops, and to the leadership's emphasis on order and conduct. Desertion did increase, particularly among conscripts, but large-scale mutinies or disintegration of units did not occur. Commanders issued orders with awareness that the war was nearing its conclusion, but continued to operate under the pretense of maintaining a defensible line. The broader strategic picture, however, was collapsing. With Berlin under siege and the Third Reich's military apparatus in freefall, it became evident that Courland would soon face surrender or destruction. Yet, until the very end, the Latvian Legion, alongside remnants of German divisions, held the line, awaiting a decision that was no longer theirs to make. The war had moved on, but Courland remained a relic of Hitler's refusal to abandon any ground, and of Latvia's unresolved national dilemma between occupation, collaboration, and survival. The initial confrontations within the Courland pocket had already tested the resolve of the Latvian Legion, but the early months of 1945 would bring a new phase, marked by intensified engagements and escalating attrition. The 4th, 5th, and 6th Courland battles, conducted between January and April 1945, represented the most determined Soviet efforts to eliminate the isolated Axis forces before the final collapse of the Third Reich. Each assault carried distinct tactical objectives, but all failed to break the entrenched defenses maintained by German and Latvian troops, even as the strategic significance of Courland continued to erode with each passing week. The 4th Courland battle began in mid-January 1945, in parallel with the Red Army's Vistula-Oder offensive farther west. Soviet commanders hoped to apply pressure in Courland that might force a redeployment of German reserves away from more critical fronts. Approximately 32 Soviet divisions, supported by over 1,200 artillery pieces and a limited number of tanks, launched a multi-pronged assault along a broad front between Liepāja and Saldus. Their goal was to bisect the pocket and seize control of the key port city of Liepāja, thereby cutting off the last viable Axis evacuation route by sea. The Latvian 15th and 19th Divisions, alongside several German units, including the 11th Infantry Division and the 14th Panzergrenadier Division, bore the brunt of the Soviet attacks. Despite exhaustion and inferior numbers, Axis defenders mounted a determined resistance, exploiting pre-prepared defensive lines, reinforced bunkers, and extensive minefields. Bitter combat occurred near the town of Prekul, where repeated Soviet infantry waves were repulsed with significant casualties. Artillery duels raged for days, and Latvian machine gun crews often held their fire until the last moment to maximize effectiveness, using the forest terrain to ambush Soviet advances. Civilian populations in surrounding areas suffered acutely during these operations. Villages near the front line were evacuated under military order, but many residents refused to leave. Bombardments destroyed homes, churches, and barns indiscriminately. Makeshift hospitals were overwhelmed, often operating in cellars or abandoned school buildings. Food shortages became acute, and the Wehrmacht's requisitioning policies increasingly competed with civilian survival needs. In many areas, local Latvian volunteers organized improvised supply networks, sometimes exchanging firewood, textiles, or dairy for German canned rations. The 5th Courland battle, launched in February, followed a similar pattern. Soviet artillery initiated the offensive with a barrage estimated at over 9,000 shells fired within 48 hours. The primary axis of advance focused again on Liepāja, supported by flanking attacks towards Skrunda and Kuldiga. The 19th Latvian Division absorbed the shock along the Saldus axis, where urban fighting broke out in the smaller towns, and trenches ran through partially demolished residential areas. The Soviet 130th Rifle Corps gained temporary footholds in the outer defense lines, but failed to maintain momentum due to poor coordination and effective German-Latvian counterattacks. One of the most intense localized clashes occurred in the forests northeast of Vainode, where Latvian units, supported by German assault guns, launched a limited counteroffensive that recaptured several key observation posts. The terrain was frozen and strewn with pine trees, enabling concealed movement but also complicating logistics. Soviet troops, lacking adequate winter gear, suffered from frostbite and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the Latvian soldiers, many of whom came from rural backgrounds, adapted to the conditions with ingenuity, using sleds, skis, and civilian winter garments to supplement inadequate supplies. The psychological toll of these confrontations cannot be understated. Soviet commanders frequently rotated frontline units due to the high rate of combat fatigue and casualties. Conversely, the Latvian Legion's units were rarely rotated, leading to prolonged exposure and cumulative trauma. Diaries recovered post-war indicate a blend of fatalism, duty, and resignation among the legionnaires. They remained under constant pressure, surrounded by propaganda from both sides, increasingly aware of the geopolitical futility of their resistance, but unwilling to surrender to a force they associated with earlier terror and deportation. The 6th Courland battle, launched in March and lasting into early April 1945, was the final and most massive Soviet attempt to crush the pocket. Over 40 Soviet divisions participated, including elements from the 42nd, 51st, and 67th Armies, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft. The offensive began with a synchronized artillery strike across the entire eastern edge of the pocket. The Soviets employed Katyusha rocket launchers and concentrated armor in hopes of achieving a breakthrough near the river Venta. Latvian and German forces, dug in behind three concentric defensive lines, responded with disciplined fire control, pre-sighted artillery zones, and coordinated withdrawals to secondary positions. The 15th Latvian Division, holding the southern approach to Liepāja, withstood multiple armored assaults that reached within 4 kilometers of the city before being repelled. Anti-tank units utilized a mix of German-supplied Panzerfausts and captured Soviet weaponry, with battlefield reports noting the destruction of over 50 Soviet vehicles during the first week of fighting alone. Meanwhile, the port of Liepāja functioned as a critical supply and evacuation hub. German naval units, including destroyers and minesweepers, continued to shuttle wounded and priority personnel to East Prussia under heavy risk. Soviet submarines patrolled the sea lanes, and Luftwaffe air cover was sporadic at best. Still, several thousand civilians were evacuated during March, along with some non-combatant Legion members deemed medically unfit for further service. Rumors persisted that elite units would be extracted for a last-ditch defense of Germany proper, though this never materialized. Despite the intensity of these clashes, the front line in Courland remained largely static after the 6th battle. The Red Army had taken heavy losses, and Stavka redirected its attention toward final operations around Berlin. For the Latvian Legion, this brief pause did not bring relief. Ammunition stocks dwindled further, field hospitals operated with limited morphine or antibiotics, and command structures began to fray under stress and attrition. Yet desertion remained rare, as soldiers clung to the belief that capture meant death, exile, or worse. The end was approaching, though no official acknowledgement was made. As April gave way to May, German radio transmissions grew erratic. News from Berlin became scarce. Officers briefed troops using carefully chosen language, speaking of strategic reevaluations and possible ceasefires. But the soldiers in the trenches knew. The war was entering its final days, and the pocket in Courland, so long isolated, so long overlooked, was about to be absorbed by the tides of post-war reckoning. What remained was only to endure until the final order arrived. As April 1945 progressed and the fate of the Third Reich became unmistakably clear, the Courland pocket persisted as one of the final strongholds of organized Axis resistance in Europe. The Latvian Legion, entrenched alongside German and a handful of other auxiliary units, had withstood 6 major Soviet offensives and remained in control of defensive positions in western Latvia. Yet, within the pocket, the sense of inevitability deepened. With Berlin encircled and collapsing, and German military command structures fragmenting across Europe, Courland's defenders faced a crisis not only of supplies and manpower, but of purpose and expectation. Despite the hopeless strategic situation, formal military structure and routine were preserved with surprising rigidity. Latvian Legion commanders maintained chain-of-command discipline, scheduled patrols, and routine fortification duties, attempting to keep their men occupied and alert. The 15th and 19th Divisions were still functionally intact, though suffering from attrition and operating below their original strength. Communications with higher German command continued via encrypted radio links. But as April drew to a close, even these transmissions became sporadic or cryptic. Orders often contradicted field realities. For example, some directives encouraged the preparation of renewed counterattacks, while others hinted at political negotiation or conditional surrender, though no such channels existed. The overall mood among the Latvian troops was complex. Many had accepted that further resistance would serve no tactical function, yet the question of surrender was not a simple one. Memories of the Soviet occupation in 1940-41 remain vivid, particularly among older soldiers, officers, and those whose families had suffered arrests, deportations, or execution. Soviet propaganda leaflets and loudspeaker broadcasts promised humane treatment and reintegration, but were widely mistrusted. Stories from repatriated civilians, when any returned at all, offered little reassurance. For the Latvian Legion, the prospect of surrender was not only military defeat, but the resumption of a feared political reality. At the same time, morale among Soviet troops stationed around Courland was mixed. Many had fought on multiple fronts since 1941 and had viewed the repeated offensives into Courland as frustrating diversions from the core objective: Berlin. Reports from Soviet political commissars indicated rising resentment among frontline troops ordered to make costly assaults against an enemy already bypassed and isolated. Still, Stavka maintained the position that no organized enemy force could be left behind Soviet lines. Soviet reinforcements were gradually reduced, but artillery bombardments continued and reconnaissance probes tested Latvian positions daily. The terrain itself compounded the stagnation. Spring thaw turned the region's lowlands into marshy traps, and roads became rivers of mud. Supply convoys, already limited, slowed to a crawl. Medical evacuations became near impossible. Forward positions were often isolated for days, surviving on dwindling field rations and relying on intermittent radio contact. In the forests near Vinod and Skrunda, platoons operated without resupply, living off stored biscuits, dried bread, and improvised stews. Ammunition was rationed strictly, with frontline units ordered to conserve fire unless under direct attack. German commanders within Army Group Courland, now under the de facto leadership of General Karl Hilpert, faced increasing pressure from local officers to clarify their strategic position. Hilpert, himself in frequent contact with Berlin, had little new information to offer. Internal German communications revealed that Hitler was still alive, at least officially, and that no surrender was to be considered. But as late April transitioned into May, unverified reports of the Führer's death began to circulate. Rumors spread among the ranks that Himmler had attempted to open negotiations with the Western Allies, that Dönitz had assumed command, and that the war might soon end, if not by formal surrender, then by simple exhaustion. Latvian officers convened unofficial councils to prepare for all eventualities. Some advocated for organized withdrawal toward the coast and preparation for evacuation. Others proposed a unilateral ceasefire with the Soviets, or even the abandonment of German command structures. These ideas were largely rejected. The absence of unified leadership and the rapid deterioration of the Third Reich's political apparatus left the Legion in a liminal state, nominally under command, yet functionally abandoned. Meanwhile, Soviet units tightened the ring around Courland, though they did not commit to new large-scale offensives. Their strategy shifted to containment. They fortified the main roadways leading out of the pocket and increased partisan activity in surrounding regions. Soviet armored patrols skirted the edges of the Axis defensive line, seeking weak points or defectors. Aerial surveillance increased. The message was clear: escape would not be tolerated, and continued resistance would only delay the inevitable. Civilians continued to bear the consequences of the stalemate. In Liepaja, food markets operated under strict military oversight, and currency lost value as barter became the dominant method of exchange. Families lived in basements or barns, sharing space with wounded soldiers and displaced villagers. The Latvian Red Cross, operating with minimal supplies, attempted to provide care for civilians and combatants alike. The fear of a violent Soviet occupation dominated conversations. Many residents prepared emergency evacuation plans, some even attempting to reach the Baltic coast on foot, hoping for a place on a naval transport that might never come. The Kriegsmarine did attempt several more evacuations in late April, moving wounded soldiers, high-ranking officers, and a small number of civilians out of Liepaja. But these efforts were increasingly symbolic. Soviet air superiority and the risk of submarine attack made the sea lanes dangerous. One such evacuation convoy was struck by a Soviet torpedo bomber on April 28th, sinking 2 vessels and killing hundreds. Afterward, German naval authorities suspended further attempts, effectively trapping the remaining defenders. By May 1st, the last formal communications from Berlin ceased. General Hilpert, recognizing the collapse of the German government, issued internal orders for all units to maintain current positions and avoid unnecessary engagements. No mention of surrender was included. The Latvian Legion, now functionally cut off from the command structure it had once served, continued to conduct patrols, maintain observation posts, and man defensive lines. Yet among the troops, silence and uncertainty prevailed. No one knew whether the end would come in the form of a final Soviet assault, a negotiated surrender, or the simple dissolution of authority. In these final days, the lines between combatant and survivor blurred. Soldiers repaired trenches they would never defend again. Officers compiled after-action reports destined never to be read. Civilians hid in root cellars and barns, listening for the sound of distant engines or artillery that would signal the beginning or end of something. Courland, once a military foothold, had become a holding ground for the unresolved consequences of war, politics, and history. The Latvian Legion waited, not for orders, but for history to overtake them. The first week of May 1945 marked the culmination of 5 years of global conflict and brought the final unraveling of the Nazi war machine. In the forests, trenches, and ruined towns of Courland, the Latvian Legion stood at the end of a path that had begun with foreign occupations, conflicting ideologies, and impossible choices. Now, on the edges of Europe, surrounded by Soviet forces and cut off from all external support, the Legion's long resistance reached its final chapter. But even in these closing moments, the path to surrender was not a single moment. It was a sequence of decisions, miscommunications, and grim realizations made hour by hour as the wider German collapse became undeniable. By May 5th, the last remnants of organized German command had begun to fragment. After Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed nominal leadership of the Reich, operating from Flensburg in northern Germany. His provisional government sought an end to hostilities, prioritizing surrender to the Western Allies while avoiding mass capitulation to the Soviet Union. In this effort, he authorized individual army group commanders to negotiate localized surrenders. However, Courland, isolated, surrounded, and without Western contact, remained outside the scope of any such arrangements. General Oberst Karl Hilpert, commanding Army Group Courland, had received no direct authorization to surrender by May 6th. Nonetheless, he understood the broader picture. German forces in Denmark, the Netherlands, and northern Germany had already laid down arms. Prague was encircled. German high command no longer issued operational orders. And critically, Courland had received no reinforcements or supplies in weeks. The sea routes had been severed. Fuel reserves were exhausted. Artillery pieces remained silent not by strategy, but because there were no shells left to fire. Within the Latvian Legion, word of the Reich's final collapse arrived piecemeal. Officers received fragmented radio transmissions or intercepted enemy broadcasts confirming the unconditional surrender signed at Reims on May 7th, set to take effect the next day. In the trenches, rumors circulated rapidly. Some soldiers prepared for a final Soviet assault. Others believed an organized German retreat might still be arranged. A few clung to the idea that Western forces would land in Latvia, despite the complete absence of Allied ships in the Baltic. On May 7th, Hilpert issued orders to cease hostilities, though formal negotiations with the Red Army had yet to begin. Throughout Courland, both sides observed an uneasy cessation of fire. Machine guns went quiet. Artillery crews stood down. White flags were raised along some segments of the line, though in others, units remained at full readiness, uncertain of the enemy's response. Latvian officers assembled their men and briefed them. The war was over. Their weapons would soon be surrendered, and they would fall into Soviet custody. The decision to surrender was fraught with psychological, political, and emotional consequences. For the German divisions, surrender meant captivity and possible prosecution, but not necessarily execution. For Latvian soldiers, however, the stakes were different. They had not only served in Axis uniforms, they had fought against the Red Army, the very power now poised to reassert control over their homeland. Many feared charges of treason, regardless of whether they had been volunteers or conscripts. The memories of the Soviet occupation of 1940-41, with its mass deportations and political purges, shaped expectations of what would come next. On May 8th, a formal surrender document was presented by General Hilpert to Marshal Leonid Govorov, commander of the Leningrad Front. Soviet forces entered Axis lines in organized columns, accepting the disarmament of German and Latvian units. The process occurred over several days and was generally orderly, though marked by suspicion on both sides. Soviet officers documented each surrendered unit, registered weapons, and separated personnel into categories: German officers, rank and file, non-German collaborators, and Latvian nationals. The Latvian Legion laid down its arms in regimental formations. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, and sidearms were stacked in cleared fields, often under Soviet guard. Commanders were called to identify their men, supply rosters, and submit personal sidearms. In some cases, entire companies were marched directly into captivity without incident. In others, confusion or fear sparked brief standoffs, resolved only by Soviet officers invoking the formal terms of surrender. Soviet military police, supported by NKVD personnel, quickly took charge of processing prisoners. German officers were segregated, while Latvian soldiers were questioned, photographed, and examined for signs of affiliation with the Nazi Party or participation in war crimes. Language barriers complicated the process, but Soviet interrogators often relied on local informants or Baltic translators. Latvian uniforms were stripped of insignia. Personal possessions were confiscated. In many cases, Latvian officers attempted to present documents confirming their pre-war Latvian army service in hopes of leniency. The response varied. Some were noted, others discarded. The human dimension of this mass capitulation was immense. In total, over 19,000 Axis troops surrendered in Courland, including an estimated 5,000 members of the Latvian Legion. These numbers overwhelmed Soviet logistics. Temporary holding camps were established in barns, schoolyards, and forest clearings. Food and water were distributed inconsistently. Medical care was minimal. Disease spread rapidly in crowded enclosures. Guards were often young Soviet conscripts, poorly trained for handling large prisoner populations, and tensions escalated quickly. For many Latvian soldiers, captivity was only the beginning of a new ordeal. Within days, thousands were placed on rail cars and transported east. Their destination, filtration camps, labor colonies, or prisons deep within Soviet territory. The NKVD categorized them based on perceived loyalty, prior civilian status, and military role. Those suspected of ideological alignment with the Germans were separated for harsher treatment. A significant number were sentenced to years of forced labor under Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code. Others disappeared into the Gulag system entirely. German prisoners fared only marginally better. Officers were typically sent to POW camps in Belarus or the Moscow region. Some were eventually repatriated to Germany in the early 1950s. Latvian prisoners, by contrast, often remained in captivity for a decade or longer. Their release was complicated by Soviet views on collaboration, national identity, and the political importance of suppressing future nationalist movements in the Baltic region. Civilian life in Courland resumed under Soviet occupation almost immediately. Red Army units restored infrastructure, re-established party control, and began recollectivization programs. Local officials loyal to the Soviet regime were reinstated or brought in from elsewhere. Schools reopened with new curricula. Churches were shuttered or repurposed. Property ownership was reassessed. Arrests began within weeks, targeting not only former Legion members, but also civilians accused of aiding them. Entire families were exiled to Siberia, often without trial. The second wave of Sovietization, deeper and more systematic than the first, had begun. For the Latvian Legion, the final battles were not fought with bullets, but with silence, decisions, and documentation. Their formal resistance ended in orderly lines of surrender, but their personal struggles continued for years to come, in camps, in exile, or under surveillance in their own homes. Courland did not fall in a blaze of glory or a climactic clash. It was absorbed, piece by by a system that had waited nearly 4 years to return. And for many who had worn the uniform of the Legion, the war never truly ended. It only changed shape. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, the story of the Latvian Legion entered a new and more complex phase, defined not by combat, but by endurance, survival, and adaptation under occupation. While the wider war concluded and the map of Europe was redrawn at Yalta and Potsdam, the men of the Legion, now disarmed and detained, entered a system designed not merely to punish, but to transform, repurpose, and neutralize perceived ideological threats. Resistance had taken a visible, military form during the war. Now it entered the realm of silent defiance, memory preservation, and, in some cases, open rebellion through other means. The Soviet authorities wasted little time consolidating their control over Courland. Military administrations were established across key towns: Liepāja, Ventspils, Kuldīga, and Saldus. NKVD detachments deployed to these areas with extensive arrest lists compiled in advance. These included not only Legion members, but local officials from the German occupation era, suspected collaborators, and even individuals who had remained politically neutral but held pre-war administrative or military positions. For the returning Soviet state, neutrality was often interpreted as passive opposition. Latvian legionnaires were divided into several categories during processing: those who had joined voluntarily, held officer ranks, or were affiliated with the German Waffen-SS were viewed as the most dangerous. Many were sentenced to 10 to 25 years of hard labor under charges of counter-revolutionary activity or treason. Others, particularly those able to prove forced conscription, were sent to filtration camps in the Pskov, Novgorod, and Arkhangelsk regions, where they underwent months or years of interrogation, re-education, and surveillance. Release often depended on the testimonies of Soviet-loyal witnesses or successful self-incrimination in official confessions. In these camps, survival demanded both physical resilience and psychological calculation. Inmates faced hunger, overcrowding, and disease. Those who retained military discipline sometimes fared better, organizing themselves into internal structures that maintained hygiene, regulated behavior, and enforced informal justice. In certain camps, former Legion members even held clandestine classes on Latvian history, military ethics, or literature, efforts to preserve identity in the face of a system designed to erase it. Back in Latvia, the Soviet regime launched an intensive campaign to dismantle the legacy of the Legion. Public discourse, education, and media portrayed legionnaires uniformly as traitors and fascist collaborators. Monuments to interwar Latvian military units were removed. Families of former Legion members were placed under surveillance. Access to university education and certain professions was denied to sons and daughters of those labeled enemies of the people. Some were deported during the renewed wave of mass exile in March 1949, which affected over 4,000 individuals across the Baltic states. Despite these measures, a form of resistance persisted underground. Former legionnaires who had avoided capture or been released from captivity joined emerging partisan groups in the forests of Latvia. These partisans, often known collectively as the Forest Brothers, conducted acts of sabotage, distributed anti-Soviet literature, and maintained secret supply networks in rural areas. Their operations were highly localized, loosely coordinated, and often ended in violent suppression. Yet their existence reflected the refusal of many Latvians to accept the Soviet narrative imposed after 1945. The Soviet response to the partisans was swift and uncompromising. Entire villages were relocated, collective punishments were applied, informants were embedded within communities, and counterinsurgency battalions were deployed. The struggle between the state and the remnants of the resistance blurred the lines between military and civilian space, and between wartime and peacetime. By the early 1950s, most organized resistance had been eliminated, but sporadic incidents continued into the mid-1950s. For many of these men, resistance was not a political calculation. It was a refusal to surrender identity. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, displaced persons camps housed several thousand former legionnaires who had managed to avoid Soviet capture by fleeing to Germany or Sweden before May 1945. These individuals faced a different kind of uncertainty. While not imprisoned, their legal status remained in flux. Some Western governments were reluctant to recognize them as refugees, fearing diplomatic consequences with the Soviet Union. Others debated their eligibility for resettlement due to their service in Waffen-SS units, despite the unique national and coercive circumstances of their enlistment. In 1950, a decisive clarification was issued by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The Baltic Waffen-SS units, including the Latvian Legion, were not to be considered criminal organizations per se, as they had not been involved in war crimes on a unit level and were conscripted in significant part. This ruling opened the door to resettlement for many exiles. Former Legion members emigrated to Canada, the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, where they formed expatriate communities that preserved Latvian language, traditions, and memory of wartime experiences. These émigré communities established cultural organizations, veterans associations, and historical institutes. While they were politically diverse, many shared a common goal: to ensure that the narrative of the Latvian Legion would not be defined solely by Soviet historiography. Memoirs were published. Commemorative events were held annually on March 16th, the date of a major 1944 battle involving the Legion. These activities often stirred controversy, especially in post-war Germany and among Jewish organizations, but within the Latvian diaspora, they were understood as acts of historical affirmation rather than political provocation. Back in Soviet Latvia, such commemorations were impossible. State archives remained sealed. Veterans of the Legion who returned to civilian life did so quietly, often changing professions, avoiding political activity, and maintaining silence about their past. Some managed to reintegrate as laborers, engineers, or clerks. Others became internal exiles, restricted in movement and employment. A few were eventually recruited into Soviet intelligence or security services, an ironic twist that reflected the regime's pragmatism and paranoia. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the memory of the Legion persisted in private. In family homes, stories were passed from parents to children. In whispered conversations, accounts of battles in Courland or near Opochka were recalled. Hidden photographs, medals, and documents were preserved in attics and cellars. For many, remembrance was an act of resistance, not against a foreign occupier this time, but against historical oblivion. The Latvian Legion's wartime actions, their prolonged isolation in Courland, and their controversial role in the broader conflict created a legacy that remained unsettled long after the last gun fell silent. In both exile and occupation, the men of the Legion navigated a shifting landscape where loyalty, identity, and survival were constantly recalibrated. Their struggle had not ended with surrender. It had simply taken on a different form, less visible perhaps, but no less profound. By the late 1980s, the buried legacy of the Latvian Legion began to resurface as the Soviet Union entered its final decade of existence. Glasnost and Perestroika, the political reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev, loosened restrictions on speech, historical inquiry, and national discourse throughout the Soviet republics. In Latvia, long-suppressed narratives returned to public consciousness, and with them came renewed debate over the role of the Latvian Legion during World War II. The question of whether these men had been defenders of their homeland or collaborators in a fascist regime was no longer merely theoretical. It was at the center of Latvia's post-Soviet national identity crisis. For nearly 5 decades, the official Soviet position on the Legion had remained unchanged. They were traitors and fascists, willing participants in Nazi crimes and enemies of the Soviet people. School textbooks, museum exhibits, and state television all reinforced this view. Those who had served in the Legion were denied veterans' rights, subject to surveillance, and barred from holding sensitive employment positions. The very notion of alternative interpretations was criminalized. But beginning in 1987, civic groups, writers, and historians began to question this singular narrative. The Popular Front of Latvia, an organization advocating for political reform and greater autonomy, opened forums on national history, inviting voices previously excluded from public discourse. Veteran accounts, hidden diaries, and oral testimonies found new audiences. A wave of samizdat publications, privately circulated works critical of the regime, circulated stories about the Courland Pocket, deportations under Soviet occupation, and the complexities of forced enlistment under German rule. This re-examination culminated in a particularly charged subject, the annual remembrance of March 16th, the date commemorating the 1944 battle where both main divisions of the Latvian Legion fought side by side near the Velikaya River. In exile, this date had long served as a point of commemoration. Now, in Latvia itself, people began gathering spontaneously at cemeteries and former battle sites to honor fallen soldiers. The Soviet authorities responded with denunciations, arrests, and counter-demonstrations. Yet the gatherings grew each year, turning into symbolic acts of resistance and identity assertion. By the time Latvia regained its independence in 1991, the question of how to integrate the Legion's legacy into national history had become unavoidable. Unlike in the West, where public opinion could tolerate ambiguity, Latvia faced the urgent task of establishing a foundational narrative for a reborn state. The Legion posed a particular challenge. It embodied both Latvian military sacrifice and the uncomfortable reality of serving under German command. National memory was pulled in competing directions, toward patriotism and toward reckoning. In the early 1990s, Latvia's transitional government undertook a limited process of historical rehabilitation. While avoiding blanket exoneration, authorities recognized that the Legion's formation occurred under coercive circumstances, and that many of its members had joined to resist Soviet reoccupation, not to advance Nazi ideology. Several legal distinctions were made. Legion veterans were differentiated from those who had served in Nazi security formations, such as the SD or Einsatzgruppen. This was in line with the earlier UN ruling from 1950. However, these measures sparked international criticism, particularly from Russia and several Jewish organizations, who viewed them as attempts to whitewash collaboration. International pressure escalated in the form of diplomatic protests and media coverage, particularly when public marches began appearing in Riga on March 16th. These events featured flags, speeches, and prayers at monuments dedicated to legionnaires. Critics abroad interpreted the marches as nationalist revanchism or Holocaust denial. In Latvia, defenders argued that the marches were not endorsements of Nazi ideology, but tributes to fallen soldiers who had no real alternative to fighting for their land under German command. This tension became a recurring feature of Latvian politics. Some political parties, particularly those with nationalist or conservative platforms, embraced the Legion as part of Latvia's anti-Soviet heritage. Others, especially parties supported by the country's Russian-speaking minority, viewed such narratives as divisive and historically revisionist. Each year, the March 16 commemorations brought renewed protests, counter-protests, and debate over the boundaries of memory. At the same time, academic efforts to produce a balanced historical record continued. Latvian historians began publishing detailed monographs using newly opened archives, examining the Legion's structure, recruitment methods, battle history, and post-war experiences. These works acknowledge the complexity of the Legion's situation, highlighting that motivations for joining varied widely, from anti-communist conviction to conscription to the simple drive to protect one's home from another occupation. Research also revealed important distinctions within the Legion. Unlike ideologically driven Waffen-SS units from Western Europe, Latvian divisions were composed mainly of conscripts and operated primarily in defensive roles within Latvian or nearby territories. There was little evidence that they had taken part in systematic atrocities or genocidal operations. These findings did not absolve the Legion of all moral scrutiny, but they complicated the prevailing binary of victim versus perpetrator that had dominated Cold War historiography. Parallel to academic work, a growing civil society in Latvia sought to honor the memory of the Legion through museum exhibits, documentary films, and veterans' memoirs. The Museum of the Occupation of Latvia, opened in Riga in 1993, became a key institution in this process. Its exhibits addressed both Soviet and Nazi occupations, attempting to present the war and its aftermath as a continuum of foreign domination. Within this narrative, the Latvian Legion appeared not as heroes or villains, but as products of a time when agency was limited and moral clarity often elusive. Meanwhile, generational change introduced new voices into the conversation. Children and grandchildren of Legion veterans began to speak publicly, not only defending their relatives, but also grappling with inherited legacies. Some challenged the idea of valorization altogether, asking whether any military formation aligned with Nazi Germany could be morally neutral. Others emphasized the need to separate personal survival from political allegiance. Their perspectives added nuance to public debate, moving it beyond polarized binaries. By the early 2000s, the status of the Latvian Legion in historical discourse had reached a kind of fragile equilibrium. Official government positions recognized the tragedy of wartime collaboration while honoring the right of citizens to commemorate the dead. March 16th was no longer a national holiday, but was permitted as a public event under police supervision. Veterans organizations operated openly, though with increasing membership decline due to age. International condemnation continued, but lessened in intensity as Latvia integrated into European and transatlantic institutions. Yet the debate never fully faded. Russia continued to cite the Legion in its critique of Baltic nationalism and NATO expansion, portraying commemoration events as evidence of fascist resurgence. Within Latvia, sporadic attempts to legislate remembrance practices, either restricting or protecting them, reflected enduring unease. Each new historical discovery or geopolitical flare-up rekindled questions thought settled. The Latvian Legion's story remained, even decades after the guns fell silent, a symbol of unresolved identity, of how a small nation caught between two totalitarian empires navigated impossible choices. For some, the Legion represented patriotic resistance under occupation. For others, it embodied dangerous relativism. For many, it was simply family history, painful, complex, and inseparable from the broader tragedy of the 20th century. And in that complexity lies perhaps the most honest legacy the Legion could leave behind. As the Latvian Legion's legacy moved further into the 21st century, its historical footprint continued to provoke controversy and introspection, not only in Latvia, but across Europe and beyond. The Legion, once a wartime military formation caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, had transformed into a powerful symbol, a litmus test for questions of national memory, historical guilt, and geopolitical friction. What became increasingly clear was that neither time nor archival access alone could resolve the deep divides that the Legion's history represented. One of the most significant consequences of the Legion's contested past was its function as a political tool, used both domestically and internationally to shape narratives about Latvia's wartime role and post-Soviet identity. Within Latvia, political parties continued to take diverging positions. National conservative factions upheld the Legion as an example of forced service under occupation and insisted on the right to honor their fallen. Left-leaning and minority-focused parties, especially those representing Russian-speaking Latvians, condemned such acts as glorification of fascism and demanded formal disavowal. This internal division intensified during election cycles, where debates over the Legion often resurfaced as proxy arguments about language laws, citizenship, and NATO alignment. The March 16th commemoration, never officially recognized by the Latvian state, but allowed under freedom of assembly, remained the flashpoint. Each year, the date drew not only participants and mourners, but also protesters, media outlets, and international observers. While these events were typically peaceful, they reflected a society still negotiating the boundaries of its historical consensus. Internationally, the topic was often framed through the lens of post-war justice and Holocaust remembrance. Jewish organizations such as the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the World Jewish Congress continued to express concern over any valorization of Waffen-SS units, regardless of local context. For them, even if the Latvian Legion had not committed atrocities, its place within the broader Nazi military system implicated it in crimes against humanity. These groups urged Latvian authorities to issue stronger condemnations, and to prevent public commemoration of such units. Latvia's response was cautious and diplomatic. Government representatives acknowledged the suffering of the Holocaust and reiterated that no war crimes had been proven against the Legion as a unit. They pointed to historical rulings from Allied and UN bodies which had distinguished Baltic conscripts from ideological SS volunteers. At the same time, they emphasized Latvia's unique position as a nation doubly occupied and deprived of self-determination. This dual line, condemning Nazism while defending Latvian conscripts, became the standard official narrative. Russia, however, adopted a far more aggressive approach. Since the 2000s, the Kremlin had invested heavily in shaping historical narratives as part of its foreign policy strategy. In state media, the Latvian Legion was frequently cited as evidence of neo-Nazism in the Baltics. Russian officials condemned March 16th events annually, sometimes issuing travel bans against participants or calling for EU censure. These accusations were often accompanied by broader claims about the persecution of Russian-speaking minorities in Latvia and the rehabilitation of fascist symbols. This use of the Legion as a geopolitical weapon was not limited to rhetoric. Russian-backed organizations, both in Latvia and abroad, staged countermarches, published critical materials, and lobbied international bodies to investigate alleged historical revisionism. The goal was not merely historical correction, but political leverage, casting Latvia's pro-Western stance as morally compromised due to its supposed indulgence of fascist sympathies. In response, Latvian historians and civil society groups worked to provide nuance and factual rigor. Institutions like the Latvian Occupation Museum and the Institute of Latvian History organized international conferences, digitized archives, and cooperated with foreign scholars. Educational initiatives in schools encourage critical thinking about both Soviet and Nazi occupations. In this emerging academic environment, younger generations began to approach the Legion not as an emotional flashpoint, but as a case study in the limits of agency under totalitarian regimes. The role of memory also played out in unexpected places, such as courtroom proceedings. In the early 2010s, former Legionnaires and Soviet partisans found themselves entangled in legal disputes over pension rights, public speech, and symbolic actions. Some lawsuits alleged defamation of war veterans, while others involved protests over monuments or memorial plaques. These cases often revealed not only historical disagreement, but legal ambiguity over definitions of collaboration, resistance, and citizenship. Perhaps the most tragic dimension of the Legion's legacy was the fate of those who did not survive to see its post-war reappraisal. Many Legionnaires perished in Soviet camps or died in exile, never witnessing the debates that would surround their memory decades later. Their voices, when preserved, came mostly from letters, court transcripts, and testimonies recorded by family members. In some cases, their graves remained unmarked or located in foreign countries, unacknowledged by any government. To address this, numerous private initiatives emerged to recover and document these personal stories. Local NGOs conducted fieldwork to locate burial sites, identify unmarked graves, and collect archival materials. Oral history projects interviewed surviving veterans and their descendants. This grassroots effort, often outside formal institutions, helped balance public discussion by reintroducing human complexity into a politicized narrative. At the same time, digital memory spaces began to form. Online databases cataloged Legion records, battle histories, and post-war movements. Social media allowed for veterans' families to share photographs, recollections, and research. These platforms fostered transnational dialogue among the Latvian diaspora, historians, and the general public. Yet they also became sites of ideological conflict, targeted by both nationalist glorification and hostile misinformation campaigns. The larger question remained unresolved: how to remember those who fought for a regime that committed atrocities when their own motivations had little to do with ideology. Should conscripts be treated as victims of war or bearers of moral responsibility? Can national suffering coexist with historical accountability? These were not questions unique to Latvia. They applied to countless occupied nations caught between rival empires. But in Latvia, the answers continued to carry immediate political weight. The Latvian Legion's presence in contemporary discourse was thus not simply about the past, it was about competing visions of what the past means. For some, the Legion symbolized national endurance, a desperate stand against totalitarianism. For others, it remained an uncomfortable reminder of complicity and the ease with which nations can become entangled in systems of violence. For most, it lay somewhere in between, a difficult, painful story without clear heroes or villains. As Latvia continued to evolve within the European Union and NATO, the Legion's memory remained a reminder that history, especially wartime history, rarely fits easily into modern categories of pride or shame. It endures as a symbol of contradiction, a military formation born of necessity, remembered with reverence, condemned with outrage, and debated with passion. The reckoning was not over. It had merely shifted form, from battlefields and prisons to parliaments and classrooms, from the roar of gunfire to the silence of commemoration. The story of the Latvian Legion did not conclude with surrender, imprisonment, or commemoration. Instead, it became a long and unresolved legacy, shaped by evolving political landscapes, scholarly reinterpretation, and generational reflection. As Latvia moved further into the 21st century, now firmly integrated into the European Union and NATO, the Legion's memory remained a complex mirror, reflecting not only Latvia's turbulent 20th century history, but also the moral and political tensions of its present. One of the enduring consequences of the Legion's legacy has been its role in defining how Latvia understands and narrates its experience of World War II. For many Latvians, the Legion was not simply a military unit, but an embodiment of the impossible choices forced upon a small nation by two totalitarian empires. This framing, Latvia as a victim of occupation rather than a participant in aggression, became central to the national narrative adopted after the restoration of independence in 1991. It influenced everything from school curricula to state-sponsored memorials, even as historians and civic groups urge more critical engagement with the past. In the realm of international relations, the Legion continued to serve as a barometer of Latvia's geopolitical posture. Russian officials repeatedly pointed to the March 16th commemorations and the legal rehabilitation of Legion veterans as proof of what they alleged to be a resurgence of fascist ideology in the Baltics. These claims were amplified in Russian media and used to discredit Latvia's democratic institutions and alliances with the West. Latvian diplomats, in turn, responded by emphasizing their nation's history of Soviet repression and the non-criminal status of the Legion as defined by post-war Allied and United Nations rulings. In 2012, the Latvian parliament officially recognized March 16th as a day of remembrance for those who fought against Soviet occupation, though it stopped short of designating it a public holiday. The law was later modified after public controversy and external criticism. Government statements have since walked a careful line, acknowledging the suffering of Legion veterans while firmly rejecting any attempt to glorify Nazism or downplay the Holocaust. These carefully worded positions reflect the balancing act that post-Soviet nations must perform when their historical narratives touch on sensitive wartime alliances. Academic study of the Legion has become increasingly sophisticated, moving beyond early emotional or ideological frameworks. A new generation of Latvian and international scholars have produced detailed, source-based analyses that examine the Legion in its full context, its creation, structure, combat engagements, ideological diversity, and post-war treatment. These works emphasize the varied motives of its members, from ideological alignment to conscription to pragmatism, and explore the Legion's place within both Nazi military strategy and Latvian national resistance. While these studies have helped clarify factual records, they have not erased the moral ambiguities at the heart of the Legion's existence. The long-term effects of the Legion's history are also visible in Latvia's social fabric. Veterans who returned from Soviet captivity or emerged from hiding often lived out their lives in silence, marginalized by the political climate of the Cold War. Some passed down their experiences within families, contributing to a subterranean collective memory that remained invisible to the state but central to community identity. Others disappeared without documentation, leaving behind questions that subsequent generations would try to answer with fragmentary evidence and official files. Since the restoration of independence, these buried stories have emerged into the open. Memorials have been restored, cemeteries maintained, and local histories published. Yet the process of remembrance remains uneven. In rural Latvia, some communities hold quiet, respectful commemorations. In urban centers, the same events may provoke public demonstrations or media scrutiny. The tension between private memory and public narrative continues to shape how the Legion is understood, both within Latvia and abroad. The Legion's legacy also intersects with broader themes of transitional justice, historical reconciliation, and democratic maturity. In comparison to post-war Germany or post-Franco Spain, Latvia's transition from occupation to independence lacked a comprehensive judicial process to assess wartime behavior. This was not due to negligence, but to the unique position Latvia found itself in, emerging from Soviet rule without control over earlier records, judicial authority, or international support for large-scale trials or truth commissions. As a result, historical reckoning has taken a piecemeal form through legislation, archival access, museum exhibitions, and public debate. Each initiative has added layers of understanding, but also reopened old wounds. For many survivors and their families, justice remains elusive, not necessarily in the legal sense, but in the moral and social acknowledgement of what they endured, resisted, or were forced to become. Today, the Latvian Legion represents something far broader than a single military formation. It stands as a case study in the tragedy of occupation, the distortions of propaganda, the survival strategies of small nations in great wars, and the perils of historical simplification. Its members, once soldiers, then prisoners, later pensioners or exiles, have been cast in every conceivable role as patriots, collaborators, victims, and symbols. No single label can contain the full scope of their experience. In the European context, the Legion remains part of a broader, still incomplete process of integrating Eastern European perspectives into the collective memory of World War II. For decades, Western narratives of the war emphasized the Nazi-Allied dichotomy, often overlooking the complex realities faced by nations under dual occupation. The re-emergence of the Latvian Legion into public discourse has helped challenge this binary, compelling audiences to consider the nuances of choice, coercion, and survival in wartime. Latvia's ongoing negotiation with this past reflects a mature society grappling with hard truths. It resists both whitewashing and condemnation, aiming instead for a layered understanding that allows for mourning, honor, regret, and reflection, all at once. The process is neither linear nor uncontested, but it continues, driven by the recognition that history must be confronted, not buried. As the last veterans pass away and living memory fades into written record, the future of the Legion's story rests in the hands of historians, educators, and citizens. Its fate will not be sealed by parliaments or courtrooms, but by how it is taught, debated, and understood by generations who never knew the war, but lived with its consequences. The Latvian Legion's last stand was not merely in the forests of Courland. It is in the persistent struggle to remember with clarity, to judge with fairness, and to understand with humility. And in that sense, its history remains very much alive,